Hey guys, how's it going? Preparing here. So right now I'm in Cologne, Germany. I've been attending Gamescom. That's why I'm here. We're a few days in, and we've basically got most of the cards that were supposed to be released at Gamescom, which is quite a few, by the way. I think it was a total of like 20 something while I was here, plus the number few that I kind of missed in the last few days because I try to save them up a little bit. I just didn't think I had this many. Today we're going to review, I think, 32 cards, something like that. And I'm not really in the best of shape. I'm after a pretty long day at Gamescom doing a bunch of presentations, stage event signings, all the stuff, and I've lost my voice, so I'm really making an effort to do this. So keep in mind, as far as the content goes, I'm mostly going to skim through a lot of these cards, especially some of the cards that may have a lot more depth than I may lead on. Maybe I'll go into a bit more detail at some other time. So let's kick it off here. First card I haven't reviewed since the last review, which you guys should check out by the way, is the Flame Lance. It's a 5 mana mage spell that deals 8 damage to a minion, which is hilarious. This card doesn't really work so well because if you really wanted to hit something that hard, you just put in Polymorph. There's actually no mage decks these days that run Polymorph because Polymorph is too slow. Well, we've seen like kind of a slow game maybe pop out of the TGT expansion. It's going to have to be really slow for this card to see any play at all in Constructed because you'd need the Fireballs, you need the Polymorphs, and then you need the Flame Lance. Flame Lance doesn't really offer much of an advantage over Polymorph. In the very odd case, you might kill like, I don't know, Mountain Giant on turn 5, rather than Polymorph just make into a 1/1 Flame Lance and completely remove it. The value is incredible. So yes, the card is pretty terrible. But in Arena, it's not really the worst thing ever. It's still kind of bad, but just having stuff that removes other big stuff is generally good. The thing is, if you compare it to Fireball in Arena, Fireball is just like so much better. Fireball you can use to burst for face damage, which is, the main thing. But the other thing is, Fireball is really effective for tempo. Like you can play Fireball and play like a 6-drop on 10 mana. You can't really do that with Flame Lance. It being 1 more mana is really punishing. But in some cases in Arena, the win condition is to play something that can't die to Fireball, like a Force Tank Max. So Flame Lance kind of works against that. So while the card sucks, it does cover a small weakness that Mage does actually have in Arena. So maybe that's why it's really doesn't seem like that worthless of a card to me. And we have the Darnassus Aspirant, 2 mana, 2/3 Druid rare with Battlecry that gives you a mana crystal, and Death Rattle that destroys a mana crystal. This card is amazing. It's just it's difficult to really fit cards in a Druid deck. All the Druid decks that we've seen in the last year in Hearthstone have been very highly themed. And this card just gives you like a temporary like mana acceleration. I just don't know if it's overpowered enough just to be default in every Druid deck, as some cards like Swipe, some cards like Keeper may be. I don't think it's quite on that level, but it is still a really good card. If Druid decks just work, if you're playing like an Arena style, ramp-ish, but not really that ramp, not really that much late game, just kind of like curved out Druid, mid-range Druid, something like that. Card seems to be extremely well fit for that type of deck. Funny enough, it does make the piloted Shredder a lot worse. If you do get this guy, you obviously don't get Battlecry effects from things that pop out of your Shredder, but you do get the Death Rattle effects, so you could be set back behind 1 mana crystal. It's certainly one of the worst cards you could possibly get out of a piloted Shredder. Then we got Wrathguard, another interesting guy that can come out of the Shredder, another 4-attack guy that can come out of the Shredder, which is pretty important. Maybe it balances out a little bit. So it's a Warlock card, it's a demon, and whenever this minion takes damage, you also deal that much damage to your hero, which seems like Flame Lance might not be that bad of a card, but don't worry, Flame Lance is still a terrible card. Wrathguard seems okay. Generally, if you're playing Zulok, you don't actually care if you take damage, because once you start taking damage, it's the stage in the game where you've basically lost already. It's a stage in the game where you're basically hoping you get some ridiculous charge or burst combination, which is usually like, 7% type of deal. So, if you're in a situation where life points actually matter as a Zoolock, you're basically pretty screwed anyway. So you kind of just don't even look at the effect when it comes to being fit in a Zoolock. So 2 mana 4/3, it seems pretty powerful. It's just that 2 mana 4/3 is not actually that powerful, while it's basically a 1/1 higher than a traditional 2-drop. A traditional 2-drop still kills it because of the way that the stats kind of are sorted out. If the Wrathguard was a 2 mana 3/4, I'd actually say it would be ridiculously overpowered. But a 2 mana 4/3, even though it's basically just that, it doesn't actually seem too overpowered, but it might be good enough to fit in some kind of zoo deck. It certainly would fit in some of the budget zoo decks. Then we have the Rogue common, 5 mana 3/7 with the combo to gain 3 attack. This card is insane. This card is really insane, at least for Arena. In Constructed, Rogues have received some really good cards in the past that just they haven't really made it to the Constructed lists, which actually has been really surprising for me, but it's a running trend, so much so that I don't anticipate this card will make too many Constructed appearances, just because if you look at cards like Dark Iron Skulker is literally the best card you can get as a rogue in Arena aside from Legendaries. Yet it's nowhere to be seen in Constructed because it doesn't work, because the rogue class is a combo one, and combo decks don't have room for cards that are just good. You need cards that are good but draw, or you need cards that are good but help the combo. And like that, Dark Iron Skulker doesn't do that. The Shadowpan Cavalry doesn't do that either. But what the Shadowpan Cavalry does do is allow you to mercilessly, brutally own some people in Arena. If you get the combo off, and you can through like a 0 mana spell like a Backstab, you might be able to get a turn 5 or even maybe a turn 4 if you have the coin. Basically Boulder Fist Ogre. And Boulder Fist Ogre is kind of that stage in the game where it's like the first huge upgrade. It's like the 6 slot. The 5-drops, like the 4-drops can kind of kill the 5-drops. But the 5-drops can't really kill the 6-drops, at least not the decent ones. So playing this guy, having these stats 1 turn earlier, is a ridiculous tempo advantage. Again, Constructed doesn't really play that way. Constructed is much more combo driven, so I don't think it's that broken for Constructed. I think it's pretty good, and maybe it'll see some kind of rogue deck, but nothing that we've seen so far from Rogue, at least. It'll have to be a whole new deck. But in Arena, it's crazy. The fact that it's common and it's that crazy, basically, maybe Rogue might be as good. Probably not better. Probably not even as good, but close to as good as Mage in Arena. Just because we'll be seeing a lot of these, and just because Rogue is already a really good Arena class. We have the Master of Ceremonies. It's a 3 mana 4/2 battlecry. If you have a minion with spell damage, gain +2/+2. And that's a really powerful effect. You could basically have a 6/4 on turn 3 if you played a 2 mana spell damage minion on turn 2. Problem is that spell damage minions that you play on turn 2 are just kind of bad. You basically have the Kobold, and you have the Blood Mage. So yeah, I don't know. It's a really cool card. Maybe it fits in like a themed deck. Maybe there's something I'm just kind of missing. But maybe we are missing something. Maybe we are missing a few other 1 or 2 drops with spell damage, and having those might just make this card totally insane. As it is, though, it's not bad. It's all right. Pretty decent in Arena. Maybe it'll work in some themed decks and Constructed, but I kind of doubt it. We'll have to see. Maybe some cards really alter that, and this is a card that you kind of have to watch out for. Suddenly when a decent card with spell damage comes up, this card might just be crazy for just a moment. We have Druid of the Saber, 2-mana Druid creature, base stats 2/1. You can offer him with charge, basically makes him into a blue gill warrior, or you can give him +1/+1 in stealth. So you can make him a 2-mana 3/2 stealth, which is really nice. I prefer that to a Gibbon Stalker generally. Yeah, I can die to a few other effects that Gibbon Stalker could survive, but you usually want the damage. When you play a 2-drop, you want to threaten a 3-drop, and 3 damage does that. So I think this card is really cool. It's really good. Again, it doesn't fit the existing type of Druid decks, but we kind of see a trend with that. None of these Druid cards really fit the existing Druid decks, so it's very likely that we'll see something new pop out, and this seems strong enough as a standalone card to maybe make that list. Of course, in Arena, this card's absolutely insane, and in Arena, it's another like high probability to get a decent number of beasts to make a Druid of the Fang really good as well. We have Crowd Favorite, 4-mana 4/4. Whenever you play a card, battle card, gain +1/+1. Seems pretty good. Just that, you know, in Constructed, the health is really important on like the 4-drop, right? So if you give it like +1/+1, it's still a 5/5. It's still basically equal to like a Yeti, because it's going to take 5 damage to kill it. So it's not really like that OP. It's just like alright. I don't really see it making too many constructed lists, but maybe it has a good fit in a deck here and there. Maybe it sees some shine, just because it might be marginally better than a Piloted Shredder. But again, I kind of doubt it. The idea is this card will be really good if you can follow it up with 2 Battlecry effects, or play 2 Battlecry effects on the same turn. That's pretty difficult to do. But if a deck comes up, probably some kind of zoo deck that is able to consistently do that, and the card is pretty damn good. In Arena, the card is generally pretty good, because most cards that are considered powerful in Arena are ones with multiple effects, and multiple effects generally involve some form of battle cry. So while the Epic slot, you know, has some good cards, it also has some really bad cards. So overall, I feel this card, while it's maybe not like that spectacular, I think it maybe improves the Epic slot overall in Arena, which is nice. And we have Bash, 3-mana warrior spell, deal 3 damage, gain 3 armor. I think in like the alpha version of Hearthstone, this is originally a priest card that healed you for 3 and did 3 damage. It's pretty cool. It's kind of like a hybrid card. We know the polarized effects of this work. We know we have Fiery War Axe. If you want to deal 3 damage, doing it twice is really nice, but actually in Constructed, often you use Fiery War Axe just for the 1 hit, especially in the mid-range and the control battles. So, yeah, 3 damage just once kind of is that. Then you have cards that just gain armor that are just really powerful, because armor is really powerful. So you gain a little bit of that. So you kind of get like a hybrid card. It seems a little bit awkward to me just looking at it, but of course there's many things that are going to change when you add 130 cards to a game, so it's really hard to say if it will be awkward in that environment. It may not be awkward at all. So because of that, it's really totally up in the air. I would predict that at some point in time, this guy will see play in some form of control warrior, maybe even in some form of like maybe more aggressive type of warrior. It just seems like a good card, just pretty good, and warrior is one of those classes that doesn't necessarily have to run only ridiculously overpowered cards. In terms of Arena, it's pretty nice, but warrior has a long way to come before it's anything but the worst class in Arena. We have a Hunter card, Brave Hunter. That's an interesting one. 1 mana 2/1 and Inspire. If your hand is empty, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero. So the reason this is totally garbage is because if your hand is empty, the card poses a threat. If it poses a threat, it dies immediately. If it dies immediately, it is exactly a Leper Gnome. And a Leper Gnome is quite threatening when your opponent is low on life, and that's the only situation where this card would be good. But a Leper Gnome is also good just played vanilla on turn 1, where this card is not. Some people argued that it's nice to have maybe 4, like if you had a hunter deck, wouldn't you want 4 leper gnomes? I'd say no. Hunter cards are good enough these days that you don't really want that. So this card seems pretty terrible. In Arena, it's also probably quite terrible. Overall, I'm happy the card exists because hunters had to get some kind of cards. I don't like playing against hunters, so giving them garbage like a Brave Hunter seems like a pretty good solution for what I would expect. So thank you, Blizzard. Then we have one of the cards revealed here at Gamescom, the Skeleton Knight. It's a 6 mana 7/4, and the Death Rattle is one of the new effects that was introduced in the first wave of cards here at Gamescom, and it was the jousting mechanic. So I got a chance to play with this card. I got a chance to play with this mechanic several times, and I'll talk about the mechanic a little bit here, and then we can kind of better understand the card. So the card says reveal a minion in each deck when it dies, Death Rattle effect. If yours costs more, return this to your hand. So it's a conditional effect, and it favors your deck if you have slower creatures, higher casting cost creatures than your opponent, obviously, right? But some parts that are not obvious is what happens in a tie. The jousting mechanic, if you get like a 5-drop and they get a 5-drop, well, you actually don't win the joust. You have to win the joust. You have to have a higher mana cost minion. So the jousting effect, on average, is going to result in a loss. Now, this might not be true if you have an exceptionally slow deck, but even then, I would argue that your chances are not much higher than 50%. And they're really only like in the very high percentage points if you're playing very polarized type of deck. But that's really where it gets interesting. So if you consider like the Face Hunter list where there's no creature with like more than 3 mana, then you consider like, let's say like a Ramp Druid. There's like no creature that's like less than 3 mana, right? So in some situations, the jousting mechanic is like guaranteed. So the cool thing is, if a card is just good by itself, good, let's not say overpowered, just good by itself, and the result of the joust counters fast decks, that is a really good jousted card. That's basically what I'm trying to say. So it's pretty interesting. Also, this mechanic will have some very high level insight when it comes to tournament play. Some players might value this mechanic in tournament play because you get some information from your opponent's deck right away. And this is something that usually impacts tournament play more than ladder play. Even though it may be more impactful in ladder play, it's just in tournament play people take stuff really, really, really seriously. So cards that might be like, you know, pretty mediocre, they might actually go into decks that play a very consistent type of game. So if you think about like, you know, if you like, let's again use the Face Hunter list, right? So if you're playing Hunter and you play like a bunch of 1-drops, your opponent knows you're playing Face Hunter. If you joust some whatever minion, it's not really going to matter. It's going to be like, oh, yeah, okay, he has an Arcane Golem in his deck. I already knew that. So these type of standard decks, you're not giving your opponent any information on 1, what you're playing, and 2, what tech choices you may have made. You're never given that information. But in some situations, taking the information from your opponent can be really significant. So especially with combo decks, especially with like a lot of Warlock lists that can be running many different type of variations, instantly getting that information from your opponent has a value in its own. It's very difficult to actually understand how much this is worth, but it's something that's really interesting to think about, and that's really what makes the mechanic such a deep one. In my experience with this mechanic, I did play with some of these cards. It's a little bit disappointing. It's a pretty high RNG mechanic, and if both players are playing mid-range or slow decks, you can expect to lose most of them. But I mean, ladder isn't that. Ladder is people play mostly fast decks, so it might be a very gratifying experience when you play this in the real game. As far as Skeleton Knight is concerned, it's a piece of crap. It may actually be like the worst card in TGT that's been released so far. You have to think about it this way. So like let's say the best case, right? The best case, you win your joust. When Skeleton Knight dies, you can play him again. In some situations, there's going to be like the dream, where you just keep winning jousts, and you keep playing this guy again and again, and he just threatens and kills big creatures nonstop with his 7 attack. I would argue that if you're winning jousts, you're playing a really slow deck already. So if you have 6 mana to spend, you're going to spend it better than on a 4 health creature. And if you look at the stats, 7/4, they're very poorly attributed. There are other cards with 7/4. What comes to mind is Salty Dog. So, like in the best case, let's say you play a Skeleton Knight and he dies, and you actually play him again. Like, how frequently does that happen? Have you guys played with 2 Salty Dogs in your deck? Well, I have. If you have 2 Salty Dogs in your hand, you're almost never going to play both of them because the card sucks, because the general average card in Hearthstone will often be better in the current board state or in the current game situation than a Salty Dog. So having a turn where Salty Dog is actually the best play is really unlikely. Having the situation come up twice in the same game is really unlikely. And I'd say if you're not playing the Skeleton Knight at least twice, it's trash. So this card sucks. But it's interesting to understand why cards suck. We have another legendary. This is a Paladin-only legendary revealed here at Gamescom. It is the Yadric the Pure. Paladin, 7 mana, 3/7, and the battle cry is the peacekeeping effect. Change all enemy minions attack to 1. This is a really cool card. It's very difficult to see how good it is. If you put this card in the game right now and you change no other cards, this card is basically kind of worthless. Because when you get zerged down, you get zerged down. If you make their attack 1, it's not really a big deal. It's not going to be a win situation. It'll counter handlock. Yes, you can maybe bait your opponent to play Molten Giants like crazy, then Yadric. That's like the best case scenario. But I believe still to this day, the single best counter to handlock is Control Paladin. And if you're playing Paladin and you're playing Yadric the Pure, you're probably playing some form of Control Paladin. So I guess that might be pretty good if handlock is a really big thing and you'd want to counter handlock in like the tournament format, but that's not really an experience that is usually going to come for the average player. I'm kind of downplaying the card. I think the card is just quite good in its own. I think it's just a pretty good card, but I don't think it's overpowered. I think it's just good. If you're in the situation where he actually gains a crap load of value, it's usually a situation where you've like already screwed. Like, let's say he actually like stops 3/5/5 creatures. If your opponent actually had 3/5/5 creatures on the board, you've probably been taking a considerable amount of damage throughout the process of him playing these cards. So you're probably basically dead, and if you spend 7 mana, not even removing them off the board, you're probably dead for sure. So yeah, cool card. I'll certainly try it. It just doesn't feel like it doesn't feel as OP as it may seem. It's pretty strong. It might see some constructed play. It may be one of the best cards ever in Arena, but yeah, have some excitement management when it comes to this, as you may. We have Argent Lance, another Paladin card. It's a weapon. It's a 2 mana 2/2 weapon, and the battle cry triggers the Joust mechanic, as I talked about, and it gives you 1 more durability. The durability mechanic is pretty good because if you're playing a fast deck, this is kind of what we talked about, right? So is the card good enough by itself? Yeah, it's kind of good enough by itself. Like 2 mana 2/2 weapon's okay. Yeah, it's no Fiery War Axe, but Fiery War Axe is pretty broken. So it's okay. It's fine. It's an okay card. And then if you trigger a 3rd durability, it's basically a strictly better Stormforged Axe, which is another pretty good card. I've seen that card come up here now a little bit in Constructed, and it's considered one of the best Shaman Arena commons. So it's good. It's solid. The one thing that I really didn't like about this card, and it is something I did get to play with this card, it's that Paladins just have too many weapons that have too many charges. So like Muster for Battle comes to mind, Cog Hammer comes to mind. You always have the True Silver. Even when you just include 2 copies of each of those weapons, it's too many weapons already. So even though this card's good, even though it's a good card to put the Joust mechanic on it, even though it kind of works, it just doesn't work because it's just too many Paladin weapons, and it's not better than the other ones. So that makes it a pretty poor constructed card, but it makes it a pretty good arena card just because you get more chances at weapons. It might see some constructed play, but it would have to be extremely specific. If like everyone out there, or the most popular aggressive deck is playing a bunch of creatures with 2 health, then this is the card you want in your deck. But it's hard to really put it in over Coghammer, and that's really the end of that. Armored Warhorse. Pretty interesting neutral beast. 4 mana, 5/3. 3 is really, really low health for a 4-drop, but you might gain charge. So, like, if this guy gains charge, he's totally insane, but if he doesn't gain charge, he's, like, really bad because he's going to die to everything. So, again, we have to look at, like, my standard, right? Is the card good enough by itself without the Joust? And the answer is no, the card is bad without the Joust. So, does the Joust work in the theme where, if you're playing a slower deck, does this help you win? And the answer to that is also no. If you're playing a control deck with slow creatures and you're playing against like a face deck, playing a charge minion with 3 health is not really going to help you because you're usually behind on the board. You're not going to be in a situation where you need to push for damage most of the time. You're going to be in a situation where you need to not die. So like Stormwind Knight is better than this card if you're playing a slow deck against a fast deck. So it's not consistent. It doesn't work well because of its stats, because of the Joust on this type of mechanic on charge. So this card is not very good, but that said, it is going to have some pretty hilarious outcomes where, you know, sometimes you're going to win a Joust that you shouldn't. You're going to put this in like an aggressive deck even though you shouldn't, and then you're going to like win a Joust over a control deck, and then you're going to think it's good. But I think the expected result of this card is not good. Then we have Tuskar, Jouster, the Walrus riding a turtle. You shouldn't be too surprised about this if you've played World of Warcraft, Wrath of the Lich King at least. Certainly some quality content from these little dudes in that expansion. 5 mana, 5/5 Paladin card with a battle cry, triggering a Joust, and if you win you get 7 health. So if you got 7 health every time, this card would be probably one of the best cards in the game, maybe if not the best card in the game. It would just be totally insane if it did that. So it's a Paladin card that makes it so it can be a little bit better than the average neutral card, and it is. It is still a really good card. Put it to the test. It's 5 mana, 5/5. If you lose the Joust, if you're playing like a slow Paladin deck, if you're playing against another slow deck, you generally will not need the health. So it's okay if you lose the Joust, right? In that situation, it's not a big deal. But you really cannot lose the Joust against like an aggressive deck. But then if you're playing a slow Paladin deck, and you're up against a deck that has like all 3 drops or less, you're really not going to lose the Joust. So the Joust is relevant only against an aggro deck, and against an aggro deck you're likely to win the Joust. So this is like the perfect example of a very high quality jousting mechanic card. Pretty good addition to Paladin. Paladin already has a lot of healing, but if this card was not Paladin, it'd be like totally broken. If this card belonged to any other class, it would be auto-include in any mid-range combo or control deck of that class. So because it's Paladin, it might still be in that situation, but you have to think a little bit because, again, there are a lot of heal effects. Master Jouster, 6 mana, 5/6 battle cry, Joust trigger for taunt and divine shield. For some reason, I'm not really like impressed with the card, but it does follow like the step-by-step rules that I've given out. 6 mana, 5/6 is like good enough. It's not really good enough, but if you're playing control versus control, it's a big enough creature that it usually will warrant some kind of removal. So if this gets removed, maybe something better won't get removed, which is pretty good. It's good enough value. And if you're playing against an aggro deck, you get Taunt and Divine Shield. So it's consistent. It's just it doesn't like really impress me, which probably means that it won't see much constructed play. It's basically like a somewhat inconsistent Sunwalker. Sunwalker's seen some constructed play, so that's why I say probably won't see any constructed play. But it is like kind of like the hallmarks of a pretty good arena card. Often people will play just very facey decks in arena, and if not, 5/6 is indeed big enough to remove still. We have Gadgets and Jouster, 1 mana, 1/2 Battlecry. Reveal a minion in each deck. If it costs 1 more, game +1/+1. So if you win the Joust, this is a 1 mana 2/3, which is pretty nice. I feel like this is a card that can replace Zombie Chow in some decks. Some decks are just ridiculously slow, and they just put in 1 Zombie Chow to kind of keep up with some of the decks. The thing is, this is a card that in that situation really screws you information-wise, and that's something that I think people haven't really thought about. So the one of Zombie Chow has been a really effective card in like some Paladin decks, and maybe you can get away with using this instead of Zombie Chow. It's also been very effective in ramp Druid, slow Druid decks, and handlock. A lot of handlocks run like 1 or even sometimes 2 Zombie Chows I've seen. So in those situations, it's a really good card because you're almost always going to win the Joust. It acts the same as Zombie Chow, but you can play it late game, where Zombie Chow you often won't want to give your opponent 5 health. So because of that, it might replace Zombie Chow, but you have to think about it. Like, if you're playing handlock, and let's say you get this guy in your opening hand, you're like really thrilled and stuff. Do you really want to tell your opponent that you're playing handlock on turn 1 of the game? I feel that can lead into a considerable disadvantage. So the card seems playable. I feel people will play it, but if the meta is defined and the secrecy of what you're playing is relevant, and right up to now it has been, I feel it might like leave those same decks. So very interesting mechanic. As far as arena, yeah, seems alright. Wouldn't go too crazy for it, but any half decent 1-drops have gained a lot of value since the tempo rush has started going. Mookla's Champion, 5 mana 4/3 Beast. The Inspire effect gives all your other minions +1/+1. Not particularly strong, but you know, maybe it might see some play in some zoo decks. It just doesn't feel overpowered, and there's just a lot of overpowered cards out there. As expansions roll out, every deck is going to run only overpowered or heavy combo cards. There might be some combo, just don't see it. It's another card that's like really win more from Inspire, but the 3 health puts it in a bad spot where you really, really need to play the hero power the turn that you play it, which means that it's a little bit better as Paladin or as Shaman, because Inspire effects trigger after the creature is created in those circumstances. Get a 2/2 as Paladin, get a little bit of a buff totem as Shaman. That's kind of nice, I guess. Yeah, seems like a cool card. I'll try it, just not overpowered. Might be alright in arena. If you're playing like a really fast deck, this is a pretty good way to curve out your deck and make it a little bit slower, because it synergizes with the fast card, and it is already like a pretty decent card on its own. I mean, I have Ancestral Knowledge, Shaman card, 2 mana, draw 2 cards, Overload 2. This card just seems pretty horrible. Like, people play cards that draw like 2 cards that don't really do too much, because they usually like work with other cards, or because they're playing really heavy combo decks. There's already a lot of draw mechanics out there. With Shaman, you can negate the Overload with like Flame Shock, but if you can't negate the Overload, screwing your next turn after you use a turn to draw is really bad. It's like, I will give up this turn, and I will give up next turn. Having 2 poor turns in a row is ridiculously bad. So this card will see, I think, very limited play. The only type of deck that might work is some kind of Malagos Shaman that works with like Ancestor's Call. Often you don't really care about screwing your turns because you're going to win instantaneously. So maybe like a 1 of in that, but I don't know. It seems pretty bad. We have Bolster. This card has received some discussion. It's a 2-mana warrior spell, and it gives your taunt minions +2/+2. So if you have one taunt minion, it seems good enough in terms of value because it's basically Mark of the Wild, but Mark of the Wild is not like constructed good, so you have to keep in mind that you really want like 2 taunt minions for this to work. And really what I think about is like Control Warrior is like the only control deck out there that doesn't actually need taunts. Yeah, people play Sludge Belchers, but you can actually play decently with Control Warrior just without Sludge Belchers. It's a deck that works without taunts, and all the tools that we've seen, all the cards that we've seen come out of TGT have either been crappy aggressive cards or cards that maybe slow down the game a little bit. So if the meta actually slows down even more than what it is right now, you really, really wouldn't need taunts in your warrior deck, like at all. So you have to think about this card as being an aggressive one. It's not a defensive card. You'd have to be playing some form of warrior deck that has a lot of taunts. So Bolster allows you to push for like board presence and damage. And that's interesting to think about. I just have my doubts that that'll work. If you guys want to try stuffing your warrior decks with taunts, maybe you'll have some success. As far as Arena though, I think this is literally maybe the worst card ever. Often when you play Arena, you just don't get any taunt creatures. So it's unbelievably bad. I think it might actually be the worst card in the game on average in Arena. So that's pretty interesting. Burgle, Rogue Rare. 3-mana spell that adds 2 random class cards to your hand from your opponent's class. So it's basically like the Nefarian Battlecry effect. But a better comparison is, of course, Thoughtsteal, which takes the 2 pieces from your opponent's deck. This really favors Priest because Priest is a class that can slow the game down, and the unpredictability is really a big factor. I feel Burgle's a bit worse than Thoughtsteal because Rogues already have the unpredictable factor. It's just that it doesn't really matter too much most of the time. Random class cards are often going to be worse than cards that people deliberately put in their deck, which is what Thoughtsteal will net you. But at the same time, if people continue to play a lot of combo decks, perhaps Burgle will be better than Thoughtsteal. And even if it's close, I can see it maybe seeing some play in some rogue decks. Like if you're playing maybe like a mill deck, it might be pretty cool to Burgle. Just gain a little bit more cards. Why not, right? But yeah, if you Thoughtsteal like a Grim Patron, that's basically like you just didn't get anything at all. And with Burgle, you know, maybe your chances are better against combo decks that you'll actually have a decent result. Injured Kvalder. 1 mana 2/4 seems broken. Well, it's pretty broken when you play Hungry Dragon. You give your opponent this creature because the Battlecry won't trigger, and you'll actually give him a 2/4 and be really sad. In the general case of actually playing the card yourself, it doesn't seem particularly good because, well, it's a 1 mana 2/1 with not much. So, yeah. I don't know. It might work with classes that have buffs. Because if you play this guy and you like Power Word Shield, or you just cast like a bigger buff on him, even if it gets silenced, he basically gains the heal effect, which is kind of true for like Injured Blade Master, which is basically what this card is trying to be. So yeah, it can kind of work with like some buffs. Obviously it has the main synergy with the Priest hero power because it can heal up, but you can't Light of the Naru combo. You can't get that Light Warden because he's missing 3 and not 4 health. It just seems like it's a little bit too weak. I think it could have been like a 2/5, and then it could be like a really good Priest card. If you deal 4 damage to itself even, it would be fine. But as it stands, it just doesn't feel strong enough. If it doesn't feel strong enough, it just probably won't see play. Gormok the Impaler. This card has got some people a bit excited, and rightfully so. It's a 4-mana 4/4 in the battle card, deals 4 damage to whatever you choose, of course, if you have at least 4 other minions. Now, having at least 4 of the minions is often a pretty difficult task, and if you cannot meet that task, obviously this card is pretty horrible. So you basically have to be playing a deck that consistently pumps a lot of creatures out on the board, and it's hard to say if it's really okay in like the face decks or in most zoo decks, but I see this card having an extremely good fit in Zoo Warlock, because Zoo Warlock runs Implosion, which can very easily allow you to push to that creature count. It also, in addition to cards like Haunted Creeper and just the general cards that produce a lot of garbage on the board, it also runs Imp Gang Boss, because it's a Warlock only card. You know, that kind of sets the role mainly to Zoolock for Gormok the Impaler. But maybe with more cards being released, maybe with some more deck archetypes, it might be included in other decks as well. But at the very least in Zoolock, unless Zoolock dies for some reason, which I can't really see quite yet, it seems like Gormok is a great fit for that deck. For Arena, pretty bad. If you have 4 creatures in play in Arena, you are playing into Flame Strike, which this guy dies to, or you've won the game already. So, yes, this guy would not really help much towards that. Another legendary, a rogue legendary, a Nubarak, 9 mana, 8/4, the Death Rattle. Returns this to your hand and summons a 4/4 Nerubian. That's a cool effect. It's really easy to do 4 damage to something, but because it spawns something else with 4 health, it kind of works. It makes it so this card is like absolutely ridiculous in top deck wars. But that's really about it. It's 9 mana. 9 mana means you lose your turn. If you're going to lose your turn, there's generally better stuff to play than a Nubarak, but I really like the mechanic. I really like the card. It should have some pretty interesting results from perhaps Sneeds, and you know, maybe people play it for fun and provide some pretty sweet highlights. Avianna, the Druid legendary, is a 9 mana 5/5, and it makes your minions cost 1. This is really, really interesting. So this makes it so you can play this on turn 10 and play any other minion you want from your hand. Bam, good to go. It also makes it so if you have cards like Innervate or the Coin, you can play like 2 or really a lot of whatever minions you want on the same turn. And it makes it so you can do something just ridiculous. Like you can do like Avianna, and then like Coin, Innervate, Kel'Thuzad, and then like Faceless the Kel'Thuzad twice, right? So just the enabling power of this card, I think, puts Ramp Druid on the map right away. With the game being slowed down, a deck that was already kind of alive, not really alive, but kind of alive in the very fast metagame that we have. This card makes it so if that deck survives, which I think it will, it gives it such a ridiculous win condition. Often with Ramp Druid, you have a hand, and if you have a hand, this card is insane on turn 10 a lot of the time. You have to consider that decks like Ramp Druid, they're playing 8 drops, they're playing 9 drops, so having this along with that just makes it so you can play both. You just tempo out with another 5/5, but it's not just that. It's not like you're just gaining another 5/5, it's that you're playing a 5/5 with a ridiculous legendary or some shit that has to be removed instantly, but so does the 5/5, or they're going to basically just be completely tempoed out of the game in the following turn. So really, really cool card, really powerful. I think it will see some play, but in Arena it seems a little bit lackluster. In Arena you need a deck that has kind of a smooth curve, but I'm sure again we'll see some pretty sick highlights. We have the Grand Crusader, 6 mana 5/5, Battlecry adds a random Paladin card to your hand. Seems alright. I think if I was to add a random class card of my choosing, Paladin might actually be my last choice. Maybe not, it's pretty tough with Warrior. Warrior has some pretty bad class cards. It's just that Paladin has a lot of those 1-drop secrets. It has a lot of like Divine Shield cards. Yeah. Just a lot of garbage. A lot of garbage. Quantity-wise, lots of garbage. So it doesn't seem all that good. If you get a garbage spell, you're not too happy. In terms of arena, I'm actually kind of torn. 6 mana, you need a big body. This is not a big body, but you get some kind of card advantage, so it's probably all right in arena. Maybe even pretty good in arena. I don't see it getting too much constructed play, but it's a cool card. I really hope that I'm wrong, because I would really love to see this card in tournaments and expect some wild results. We have Confuse. So you get the Crazed Alchemist effect on the entire board, but that's all you get for 2 mana. You swap the attack and the health of all minions. It might make it easier to use certain Shadow Wards or use some certain combination of cards to steal some creatures, do whatever you want. But is it really worth the card? I don't know. I feel like maybe this card will work in decks that are running Divine Spirit Inner Fire combo, because you could replace Inner Fire, and if a lot of decks are running like hyper aggressive creatures with high attack and low health, you could use it to stall out the game a little bit, and you can use it to finish off your opponent in the form of kind of like an Inner Fire effect. So I can see it seeing some play in some decks. I just don't think those decks will be good. So I don't think we will see this card played. And because it doesn't really offer much value, I feel like it won't be too great of an arena card either, but there's worse stuff out there. And then we have the Warhorse Trainer. 3 mana, 2/4. Your Silverhand recruits have +1 attack. This is just an ongoing effect, so it's not like you buff them like you do with Quartermaster. But it is really interesting because of the mana and stats of the card. So whenever you're playing Paladin, you really never want to do a dude on turn 2, because often it's just pretty sad, it doesn't do enough, and you start losing the game already. But if you have this guy in hand, he's just really good on turn 3. It can save you in the game, where your dude can gain 1 attack that you played on the previous turn, can trade into their 2-drop, and you have a solid 3-drop body. That's very threatening, because you can maybe play Muster for Battle after or even before it, maybe even the coin. So a very threatening card, can be effective, can save you the early game, and it's also a pretty good card in the late game. It can maybe push for some extra damage when you need it, maybe gain some favorable trades, maybe give you lethal. So if it's a good standalone card, if it's a good defensive card, it's just a good card. It's a solid good card. Solid good cards. There's a lot of them. But I think there's going to be decks themed around hero powers. I think Paladin is probably going to have one of those iterations. So if it does, this card will see some play, because while it's not an Inspire mechanic card, it is kind of one. It's a card that encourages you to use hero power, and the more of these effects that you have stacked into one deck, the more effective it's going to be overall. Flash Heal. 1 mana, restore 5 health. Man, this card looks pretty sad and pathetic. If when you first look at it, you have like Light of the Naru, which heals for 3, but then you get the Light Warden, and the Light Warden is 2 health, and you need to kill a Light Warden or it's going to kill you. And sometimes it does just win you the game. So I feel like Light of the Naru is just really, really, really good compared to Flash Heal. And that makes it so only decks that already run Light of the Naru would even consider running Flash Heal. So it seems like it might not get too much play, but Flash Heal might just work really well with Akanai Soul Priest, and maybe some kind of like really wild combo deck where you just have ridiculous burst just comes about and becomes a thing. I really hope it does, because I think that would be a really cool deck to play. It just seems somewhat unlikely that would materialize, but we'll have to see. Card's terrible in Arena. Fist of Jaraxxus. This is probably the most exciting card I saw today out of the few that were revealed on stream at Gamescom. 4 mana Warlock rare. Whenever you play or discard this, deal 4 damage to a random enemy. So if you were to cast this, you'd be very, very fucking sad, because 4 mana to do 4 damage to a random enemy. Enemies are considered all your opponent's creatures and your opponent's face. So usually when it's a random enemy taking damage, you are not going to be satisfied with the result. And paying 4 mana to do 4 damage to something that you often don't want it done to is really bad. But Warlock is kind of a class that has some ridiculous tempo swings, and this is another card that works in a very strange way. If you can trigger this from a discard, it's just so cool. So cool. Additional tempo. You can remove another creature off the board, you know. And usually the cards that discard cards are really high tempo cards already. So stacking the tempo might be like a real thing. We might see tempo Warlock rather than Zoo Warlock with this card to start. Maybe cards that haven't been played in the past with discard mechanics are suddenly playable again. It adds so much depth. I think it's impossible to really predict if it'll see some play, but I really, really hope it does. In terms of Arena, though, I wouldn't expect much. You don't often get cards that discard cards from your hand, and you wouldn't want this as a standalone card. We have Living Roots, Druid 1 mana spell, and you can choose to deal 2 damage, which is, you know, what cards already do that, 1 mana, 2 damage, or you can choose to summon 2 1/1 saplings, and that's really good. This card is like insane, actually. And I'm really happy it's on Druid, because Druid's like already a slow class, so giving them this makes it so this is a defensive card. If they gave, like, you know, more aggressive classes cards like this, like if Warlock got this, I'd be pretty upset. So it's a really good fit on the Druid. It makes it so you can deal early threats if you want. And it makes it so, like, if your opponent plays like a 2/1 creature, you can counter with 2 1/1s to like take back the tempo and start winning the game right away. That's really cool. The 2 1/1s offer combos with like Violet Teacher, with like maybe even Soul the Forest might be. It's just so many possibilities, but it's already a good card even if you take away all the combo potential. So very exciting stuff. It's often the small cards that make the biggest difference in Hearthstone. Charged Hammer. This is a shaman weapon dictated by the color of the border on the text. It's a 4 mana weapon, 2 attack, 4 durability, and the death rattle makes your what is normally a totem summoning hero power, which could be something else when you lose this weapon. It changes that into a deal 2 damage hero power, which is considered pretty premium. Like, having a hero power that just does 2 damage to whatever you want is considered like pretty high value. There's actually cards that by themselves have that effect. So this card is pretty good as a result, I feel. It's just like really slow, but you can kind of change the slowness. Like, it's, yeah, you might have to hit this weapon 4 times before you get that death rattle, but the death rattle of a weapon can trigger from you just replacing the weapon, and Shaman already has a lot of weapons and already has a lot of weapons, or it has another weapon with a death rattle effect. So I really like this. Death rattle weapons make it so weapons don't necessarily have to compete with other weapons. You can just play them and forcefully trigger death rattle effects, and doing so might make this card a very interesting one, because you might decide that it's time to like push for face damage and just replace this weapon to gain this hero power bonus. So I don't know if this card will make like constructed decks. Probably actually wouldn't. But I really hope that it does, because the plays that it would allow you to think about, it'd be so amazing to make like huge plays. Like, suddenly from going to a board control type of game, I'm going to go for like a face game, a very complicated type of like forward thinking. You know, I'll deal like 2 damage over the next 3 turns from this, and then I'll like swing in my other weapon. You know, it's just like so much thought goes into the possibilities and outcomes of this card, and I really enjoy that. And we have a card that was revealed just after the Gamescom release tonight, and it is Strauses Champion, warrior creature, 2 mana, 2/3. The battle cry is, if you're holding a dragon, gain +1 attack and charge. That's a really cool card. It's basically like a 2-mana 3/3 charge if you're playing a dragon-filled deck. Warriors have actually been able to run Dragon Warrior, but they've had very few dragons, and they've usually had to wait until the mid to late game to actually play their hold mechanic dragon pieces. So this card isn't like really like broken, because like it's not like a 2-mana 3/3 charge in an aggro deck. There are no real aggro dragons, right? So if you play this aggressively, your deck is just not built to finish off the opponent in an aggressive fashion most of the time. So it's not going to matter that you get a 3/3 charge on turn 2 in that case most of the time. But it is still a really powerful presence if you do. And yeah, overall it's just a really solid card. I really love these type of cards that are just good enough by themselves. They're really strong if you're playing a slow deck. And they're not worthless if you're not. So a lot of really interesting things at play. It's not overpowered because it's not consistent with the aggro theme, but it's just cool. So overall, great cards. Hope you guys enjoyed my review. I'm just going to end it here because I've been talking for a while and it's not too great for me, but hopefully I've given you guys a lot to think about. I might go back and review some of the cards again to maybe give you guys a bit more depth to them, because when it comes to Hearthstone, thinking about the options, possibilities, and combination of plays and cards is really what I love. So this video could have been 5 times longer given the chance. But still, I hope you guys enjoyed what was there, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.